All right. All righty. All righty. Thank you, Eric. And here we are, live in our world, as you are live in your world. And the world is the world, and we are in it. So let us calmly rejoice and open up our immediate and momentary book of life in order to see what is in store for us this evening. Well, it starts off, I suppose, it starts off like as a question, a very basic question, as we approach this vast work of art, a masterpiece of literature, The Mysterious Garden by Shabistari, a work in the genre of the literature of the sublime. You could say, or you could perhaps say, perhaps more comprehensively, that it is a work of poetry with poetry's ultimate theme as its very subject. Poetry with this ultimate theme as its very subject. And what might that theme be? Well, from moment to moment, that theme is unnamed, because that theme belongs to, as part of, as a basic element of, what I would say to you, an unseen world. So such vague and paradoxical, or dare I say it, poetic language is in our minds as we approach this masterpiece of literature. But, I would think, actually, a more practical question for us is, as beings who are motivated by our curiosity as to what is it that Walker is talking about? What is it that what's the story here? What is the story? And we have to ask ourselves, well, is it possible for us to translate into the terms of our own experience? And yes, in the terms of our inmost experience, in the terms of our inmost experience by which we interpret to ourselves what we have come to know in our innermost being, in our innermost soul, in our innermost hearts as true, whether we come close to it, whether we are near to it, or whether we are far from it, or whether we are nostalgic for whatever memory we have of it, or whether we've never known it, whether or not we simply hunger for it. There's something basic here to all of us, I think, that we can take and wrap around ourselves as a mantle as we approach this world that Shabistari will conjure for us verbally in the unique alchemical realm of spiritually themed poetry. So it does come from a specific time. It comes from a specific context in world history and a specific place, a real geographical place with contours that can be found on a map. He lived his life in Tabriz, or in the vicinity of Tabriz. His parenthetical dates are 1288 to 1339, I believe. In other words, the beginning of the 14th century. And in Tabriz, this was a time of transition and of transition between further transitions. A time of, well, it can be described as conflagration. It can also be described as a golden age of Sufism, the mystical element in Islam, Sufism, with its great treasure that it bestows upon the world, aesthetically and spiritually and literarily, and we're going to be looking at it in that way, as a treasure of Sufic literature, a golden age of Sufism, occurring, and there have been many actually, as there have been many cataclysmic times, occurring during the cataclysmic time of the Mongol invasions, the horsemen sweeping down from the north across the vast steppes and devastating those towns and cities and trading posts and oases along the Silk Road, and all the vast territory on each and every side of it, and the trading centers and the centers of commerce and the centers of intellectual exchange and the centers of human richness augmenting itself through transactions, internal and external, to give to us as a gift a stream of history which we can study. And then we can go through and open certain doors in that history and find ourselves in all of these hidden worlds given to us by the individual consciousness of poets, let's say, and of many others. But tonight we concentrate on poets. So it was a time, of terrible, terrible devastation and transition. But as I said, it was also a time of renewal and learning and, a cosmopolitan blending of many different peoples. Of course, sometimes a terrible clash, but other times a harmonious blending and a rich exchange of ideas. Ideas which, once they enter circulation, in the cosmopolitan body politic, undergo their own dynamic transformations, sometimes leading farther into truth, and sometimes setting up obstacles to truth. And sometimes, this is of such themes as these are composed the songs of the rise and the fall of civilizations. And so it was in the wake of the devastating, conquering horseman herds coming down from the north. There were new systems of culture established. There was, after the destruction, of course, as always, for this is how it goes on, our human history, there was a rebuilding of the places that were changed and devastated so cataclysmically by these invasions. And who helped with the construction? The spiritually enlightened helped. That's who, as they always do. And so the Sufis were there with the various forms of social organization that they had created as communities living, and they were there to help construct and reconstruct and modify and enrich these cultures amidst all of this welter of change. They were there to help with systems of farming, systems of education, systems of communal learning, systems, habits, patterns, disciplines, of the cultivation of literature and the cultivation of inner learning and forms of meditation and of worship and of understanding and of views of the world which had much to offer those who came from other cultures who had their own views of the world and their own views of the sacred, and their own views of the sublime, and of good and evil. And it was a rich and cosmopolitan mixture very often. And then there would be periods of reaction, of course. And so here's how it was. Eventually, the Mongols became the Il-Khanids, and they were the ruling house. And they themselves came from religious roots of animism, but it incorporated also Buddhism in all of its forms, which they themselves originate from monastic traditions and animistic shamanistic traditions and cosmopolitan traditions of scholarship and study. And there was a tradition also of travel, because once you have centers of culture in all of these different places, then there can be stable interchange of goods as well as ideas between all these cultures. And in Sufism, there is the tradition for the dervish to travel and to go from place to place, there to absorb learning and to transmit learning and to scatter the seeds, so to speak, so that new germinations can occur and new forms of life can take root in new forms of terrain and soil and culture. And so this was how it was. And there were Christians with their churches, And there were the Jews with their synagogues, each with their own inner traditions, their own theologies, their own understandings of their supreme being, of their God. And there was rich interchange among them. And there was strong and harsh reactions at times. After the Ilkhanids was the reign of Abu Sa'id. This was the imposition of a more literalized form of the religion, and this caused many houses of worship in many traditions to be abruptly closed down, and many interchanges of ideas and communities of thought had to go underground, so to speak, where they continued to transmit their goods. This masterwork, Shabistari's Garden of Mystery, or sometimes it's called the Secret Garden, comes to us from such a time and from such a place. And it has come to us having passed through many wise and loving hands. Many learning communities from the inception of this work have studied this work. And this is the way that the alphabet is, all of the alphabets. Each one is a resonation chamber for all the creative thought that has been formed into it and drawn from it. And once our own intuitive, aesthetic, poetic eye is opened, we become the inheritors of that in kind of a loose and free way, and other times in a rigorous kind of way. The way that I'm following now, well, it's up to you to decide. But anyway, let's visit with Shabistari himself in his own words and see and explore a little bit more about the circumstances under which this work came about. He writes, 717 years had elapsed since the Hejira, when suddenly, in the month of Shawwal, a messenger endowed with 1,000 graces and virtues arrived here from the learned society of Khorasan. In Khorasan lived a great man of renown, whose many graces were like a fountain of light. All the people of Khorasan, great and small, said that he stood supreme in his epoch. He was the joy of the world and a light of the soul, this leader of the mystics, Sayyid Husseini. Let me just add, in Khorasan, that's now Herat in Afghanistan. Back then it was called Khorasan. And like so many of the places around it, though separated by vast and remote stretches of wild ground, they were centers of learning and deep thought, timeless thought. Let us look further into that. So this Sayyid Hosseini, this is what he did, as Shabistari tells us. He had written a letter concerning spiritual meaning, which he sent to the masters of spirituality. Within the letter were many difficult expressions used by the masters of symbolic illusion. He had arranged in verse a series of questions, each a world of meaning within a few words. A series of questions, each a world of meanings within a few words. The messenger read the letter to those present, and surprised silence fell over the assembly. The friends of that assembly became interested and turned their attention toward this humble dervish, who was no doubt a traveler himself. One of the most accomplished adepts of this path, who had often heard me speak of these subtleties, said to me, "Give these questions answers now, since there is benefit in this for everyone." I replied to him, "What need is there? I've already dealt with such questions in treatises." "That's so, but regarding these questions," he said, "I want you to answer them in verse." stepping aside from the text for a moment. This is an individual, Shabistari. He is telling us his story here. He's a worker in an assembly. This is an assembly of the interested. Note that that word is used in there. You can call them the mystically endowed. You can call them the gifted intuitively. You can call them all of this, but they are the ones who are interested. For it is in this field of study that interest is the beast of burden. Interest is what carries the mind into the subject matter. And the riches that are revealed in there are made known, not so much to our inflated notions of our own ability to understand, no, but to our humble and sincere interest, the sincere seeker. Well, so he wants to hear the answers in verse, not in a treatise. Okay, this is the beginning maybe of a thematic consideration here. Because why would that be? Why would a seeker, a student, demand of Shabistari, a teacher in this assembly, why would it be demanded of him or asked of him? They were very respectful. Adab is what they called it, decorum, courtesy. And it was their way of expressing their reverence for each other as fellow students of this most illuminative way. And yet he challenges Shabistari. I've heard the treatises, I've studied the treatises, he seems to say, but I want to hear your answers in verse. Why would that be? And the thematic consideration is this. Shabistari, as a student of and an exponent and an appreciator, is one who is steeped in the inner truth of the Quran. And the Quran is a book like no other. The Quran was given in sentences, one after the other, as revelations by the angel Gabriel to Muhammad. It was recited and it was written in the form of stories, of revelations, of statements, of admonitions, of arguments, of questions, of symbolic depictions, and yes, I'm sure of treatises, and yes, of course, visionary recitals. All of this contained in this book. And what they were doing was they were seeking for the understanding of the meaning of everything that was given to them in terms of their own inner lives, in terms of their own inner consciousness, in terms of their own soul, on its journey into a greater understanding of being. And along the way, as I mentioned, it was a cosmopolitan time, and there were all kinds of schools of thought and study and approaches and persona and burning questions upon which the fate of the world seemed to hinge. Doesn't it sound oh so familiar, yet unfamiliar to you? But at any rate, Shabistari, for himself, he saw that the nature of being as it was revealed to him was something that could be expressed. I wanted to say described, and I guess it could be that too. Described and expressed in the form of an awareness of the unity of being. This is where Shabistari begins in his approach to the basic questions. The unity of being. He is a member, so to speak, of that school, of that theological point of view. The unity of being, and yet, in the midst of a seemingly fragmented and disordered world, a unity of being appearing in disunity, changelessness, making itself known amidst change, with guidance from the tradition, the content of the Quran, and the extra-Quranic body of literature, the statements of the Prophet Muhammad called the Hadith, these statements that do not appear in the Quran, but they are statements attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, and they are collected and studied and contemplated as part of the sacred literature. And I believe that, and I'm only a student of this, of course, I myself partake of the cosmopolitan inheritance that is given to us as citizens of the 21st century, with access to all these bodies of lore, access to all these books, access to this welter, this plethora of sacred interpretations of the world from every tradition imaginable and every reaction to every tradition imaginable. It's all available to us. And what have we to follow? We are only guided by the light of our minds, guided by our interest, guided by our sincerity. Isn't it much like the world that Shabistari knows is our world? A world of multiplicity, a vision of unity given, granted primordially to the mind in the light of God. When God first spoke the word kun, which means be, and it was. Sound familiar? Well, it soon becomes unfamiliar. The one becomes the many. The one utterance of the primordial origin becomes like the reflections in a mirror shattered, endless reverberating echoes, endless shattered reflections and jagged frames of the original utterance. And yet, this is our milieu. It is in the midst of which, of which we are born, which we come to be, in a state of ignorance, reflecting this. So we seek to be educated as we go along. And let us hope that our footsteps are well guided by sincere interest, and that sincere interest in its seeking finds enough to keep it going, to be nourished and strengthened in its sincere seeking. Anyway, there is a hadith of the Prophet where God says, I was a hidden treasure, and I desired to be known. I was a hidden treasure, and I desired to be made known. And this is the explanation of the world coming to be. The world, then, is the place where we will find the unity of being. In a world of manifestation, we will find the original source. It's a rigorous way, is it not? And yet it is a free way. A free way. Anyway, so when Shabistari is asked to answer in verse, this is kind of what they're kind of alluding to. I mean, in the unity of being and in the multiplicity of manifestation, there are treatises, proclamations, there are propositions, and yet there is this other polarity of understanding, this inner polarity of understanding. There is the mystical state. There is the state of inner illumination. On its objective pole, we could call it existence. On its subjective pole, we praise, or we utter from within because we are filled with the understanding of it. And it takes a certain form. And that form is associated with poetry. And so this dervish was asking Shabistari, yes, I know of these other answers, and I know of the questions put to us by this noble mystic from Khorasan, but I desire that you answer in verse. In other words, I want your answer to have the original taste of the illumination that brings it about, that makes it come alive. And so Shabistari, he humbly responds. He humbly responds. So, as Shabistari himself tells us, and we return to his words here, because of this entreaty, I began to recite. I answered the letter neatly and concisely. Suddenly, I recited to this circle of liberated souls, speaking without thinking or repeating myself. I said, by your grace and charity, please overlook my faults. Everyone knows that I've not in my life used poetry to express myself. Though I am naturally gifted with words, I've only rarely recited poetry. I've indeed written books of prose, but I've not busied myself with a Mathnawi. Meter and rhyme can't measure inner meaning. Not every container can hold the Spirit's meaning. Inner meaning is not found in words, any more than the Red Sea is held in a cup. By using words, I'm already in difficult straits. Why increase the difficulty by stringing verses? These words are not a boast, but said in gratitude and apology to the people of heart feeling. I'll not be disgraced for writing poetry, since another Attar won't appear in 100 centuries. Okay, I step back for a moment from the text with this marginal gloss. Shabistari here is alluding to his tradition. He's alluding to this inner dialogue, which is there in the heart of each of these learned students, in this assembly, of which he is a part. And there are the illuminated persona in the creative imagination, in the inner heart of all those studying, in this circle of liberated souls, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of guidance. And for Shabistari, he is referring to Attar. Attar, who I think Attar was about 100 years, maybe a little bit less than 100 years before Shabistari. And Attar was the exemplar, the exemplary touchstone for the Sufi poets. He composed the great allegorical epic, The Conference of the Birds. And for someone such as Shabistari, in his immediate milieu, Attar cannot be surpassed in the realm of the field of poetry, but Attar can be contemplated. Attar is a gift of the god as an exemplar of what is possible of the sacred that can be conveyed and expressed in poetry. And so, Shabistari wants to be very clear in assuring us that he is no Attar. He's not trying to do anything to mess with that kind of hierarchical structure, which is so important as a process of learning. And they were all very aware of this, and part of their courtesy, as I mentioned, their adab was this kind of string of hierarchical reverence and understanding in the ways that they referred to each other. And he certainly doesn't want to be a usurper in that sense. We are looking also, too, just to throw this out, it's a trickling down, or maybe it's a trickling, or it's a manifestation of an upper source, of the manners of the aristocracy and the aristocratic view of the world. We've spent so much time in the previous centuries in Western culture, and also in all cultures, I'm sure, studying the political aspects of this notion of aristocracy. But aesthetically, we get a different kind of road into it, because here we can begin to understand notions of ceremonial and symbolic speech and the meaning behind them, not in reaction to them or not to endorse them, but only to look at their meaning artistically, to see if there's something here for us to understand in the way meaning is transmitted, you see. So, returning to Shabistari now. He's speaking of Attar and Attar's inheritance, his relationship to that poetic inheritance, and now the step that he has been asked to take to compose his own poem, knowing who his predecessors are, having studied them and learned from them, having their lessons imprinted upon him. And now he's taking a different step. It's like he's taking apart, in a certain way, an inheritance of learning that he has in order to put it together in such a way that will allow him to, dare I say it, further the art form. So, back to Shabistari to continue to look at how he expresses it. The literary errors and graces of 100 hidden worlds would equal but one brief passage in the work of Attar. But this comes through occasional grace. This is the poetic gift. This comes through occasional grace, not from snatching angels' words like demons. Eventually, says Shabistari, I answered the letter's questions and wrote them out, one by one, no more, no less. The messenger respectfully took the replies and returned home on the same road. Later, the friend who requested replies asked me to expand further on them. So the letter was written, the letter was sent, the letter was received. The messenger came back with a further request. Expand further on them. A deeper step? Shabistari is up to the challenge. He says, Shabistari says, or he says he was asked, he was requested to unveil the inner meanings of this matter, make the essence of this gnosis truly clear. I hadn't the chance in those moments of rapture to convey the inner taste of my spiritual state. Let's stop there for a moment. Shabistari says this. I hadn't the chance in the state of mystical rapture to convey the inner taste, the spiritual sense. In other words, he was saying, oh yes, the fire in my head was kindled and a work was created, and yet some element of it remains to be expressed. So, it's like back to the drawing board. So, here's what he says, starting anew, as if to begin again. It's impossible, says Shabistari, it's impossible to describe such experiences in words. And only the adepts of mystical states know these states. Yet, by the counsel of the founder of our faith, I could not deny this sincere inquirer's petition. In other words, he was going to be generous of his time, generous of his energy, generous of his intention, generous in his work, and he was going to respond. So, Shabistari says, so I set out to make these secrets more clear. And the parrot of eloquence burst into speech. I set out to make these statements more clear, and the parrot of eloquence burst into speech, with God's grace and help guiding me to success. I was able to deliver the whole thing in a few hours. My heart asked the divine presence to name the work. The reply came to my heart that this is our garden. My heart asked the divine presence to name the work. The reply came to my heart. This is our garden. Since his presence has named this book the garden, may he forever illuminate the eyes of all hearts. So there you have how the title of this work came to be. And there you have a little bit of the story, a little bit of the to and fro, of the back and forth, of the push and pull, distilled in a few brief statements. Oh, rest assured that the travail itself filled the moments of his contemplation and his expressive work. Be assured that those moments were filled with a true presence, even as it is summarized so concisely here. This is how the work came about. I am struck at the moment when he mentions that in a space of a few hours, the work as we know it, the Garden of Mystery, was composed. But now you might have an idea of the long foreground of such a work, which is, I would say, in the way that I'm thinking of it right now, is no less a part of the work than its ultimate crystallization as the work of literature. But to isolate that composition, that act of composition in its moment of composition, Shabistari tells us this vast work of over 1,000 rhyming couplets was composed in the space of a few hours. This in itself is a sign. This in itself is a statement. Because Shabistari was, you could say, of his style, he was a scholastic, an expounder, a teacher, a promulgator, a writer of treatises, a philosopher. But this mode of expression resulting in this work was composed under completely different circumstances, a few of which are described in the things that I've just shared with you, among which is it was composed in a matter of hours, as if in a spell, as if under a spell of illumination, where, and he refers to it in other places and other times, not thinking of what he was writing before or after, nor repeating himself. In other words, without self-consciousness, it just took its form as it came to him, in utter spontaneity. And that's a statement of the nature of the poetic utterance, which is you could look at it in that way. The opposite is also true, of course. Sometimes a moment's utterance is simultaneously a long and endless labor. That is also true. Both of these things are true. The Holy Ghost of poetry in our minds understands that both of these things are true. And sometimes we have access to that Holy Ghost in our minds. We call it inspiration. And we know what is true and what is not true and how they can blend back and forth into each other. And our hands provide the world with a form that captures that, like containing lightning in a bottle. Such a work is Shabistari's work. The Garden of Mystery, a garden of mystery, a secret garden. Well, so that's just a little bit of how that can be. Now, the parrot of eloquence. That's a thing that I wanted to think about for just a moment. I'm thinking about a young calculator. One of the themes of Shabistari's work, as in any work, is the limitations of the rational consciousness and understanding the ultimate truths. This is an age-old theme, for what is more unique to us as human beings than our rational consciousness? And what is more unique to us as human beings than the shortcomings of our rational consciousness? And what is more unique to us as human beings than a vast history of literature which offers us ways, means, and stories and legends and metaphors to come to grips with the limitations of our rational consciousness? So, I'm thinking of a calculator. A young calculator named Adi. Oh yes, Adi was skilled in the language of the proposition, of the conception, of the utterance of the inner anamnesis, skilled as well in the way that these original ideas unformed are formed into recognizable forms for our cognition, skilled in the major and minor premises, skilled in the terminology of demonstration, skilled in the Aristotelian modes of expository understanding, skilled in the measures of the symmetries, of the geometries, and the formulas and algebras of mathematics. A skilled mathematician. Adi, the very word, means the calculator. Adi was a sincere student of the sublime. And it came to pass that Adi was admonished or advised or sent by his teacher. Adi, you are a dervish. It is incumbent upon you to travel, to be like a seed, germinating from place to place, over the remote lands, going from here to there, learning and teaching and being taught, and sharing your learning. I will give you this advice, said Adi's teacher, whose name is unknown to me. Go south. He was told this in Bokhara. Go south. Seek the meaning of the snake and the peacock. So Adi traveled. Adi went south. Adi left Bokhara. Adi lingered in Khorasan. Adi went past Khorasan, all the way to Iraq. It was in the desert that he came upon an actual snake and an actual peacock. And they were having a discussion. They were having a discussion about their respective merits. Said the peacock to Adi, who had arrived. We are having a discussion, said the peacock. We are having a discussion about our respective merits. Me, the peacock, and that one, the snake. We are having a discussion about our respective merits. I, the peacock, am here to say that my feathers are beautiful. I, the peacock, am here to say that the iridescent play of light upon my feathers and my pride in glowing, when my tail unfurls in my pomp and my glorious splendor, I, the peacock, am an example to human beings of the heights they could attain, of the ways that they can reflect the divine beauty. That is my merit. I am discussing this with the snake, said the peacock. And then the snake took its turn to speak. The snake said, yes, you are the peacock. Yes, your feathers, they glow and shine. Yes, you screech, and your cry is grating and harsh and unpleasant. And yes, your feet are big and ugly. And yes, you hardly fly at all. Ah, but I, the snake, I am a reminder to human beings of their nature, just as much, maybe even more so. I, said the snake, like the human being, is low to the ground. I slither and squirm and change my shape as I slide along over the rough particles of the world, low to the ground, guarding the treasures of the earth. I do. Defending the treasures of the earth. I do. With a means to survive all my own, so that if you tread upon me, beware, for I can bite. And then, of course, it was too much for the peacock. The peacock's nature is the peacock's nature. And the peacock said, "Oh, but you are ugly and covered with dust. Oh, but you crawl upon the ground. And oh, you're an obstacle to human beings. You are a danger to human beings. You are in their way. You are secret and mysterious and malicious and venomous. And you strike. Oh." And of course, the snake played upon the peacock's vulnerabilities. "Your feet are ugly. Ugly, I say." "Oh," said the peacock, "I can't stand it. Don't start talking about my feet." Oh, anyway, so, everything devolved from there. It was the peacock and the snake in their eternal enmity. Adi was paying attention the whole time. Adi was witness to the manifestation of the characteristics of these beings, and they were right before him. He was hearing their very words. He had been commissioned and sent by his teacher to study the meaning of the snake and the peacock, and here before him was the actual snake and the actual peacock, and here was what they were saying. Here were their conceptions and their ideas as they saw them. Here was their conflict. Adi, suddenly, he was moved by the desire to speak, and so he spoke. And he said to the snake and the peacock, "Ah, snake and peacock, it is only now that I see the meaning of your conflict and of your two forms. It is only now I see the ways in which you are right and the ways in which you are not right. Oh, I see it so clearly. You, peacock, with your iridescent feathers and your magnificent plumage and your pride and your bountiful pomp, are a lesson to human beings of the beauty that is there to be seen, reflected by your essential form as the peacock. Whereas you, the snake, yes, you are an example to human beings. Like human beings, you are bound to the earth, low to the ground even. Like human beings, you are called upon by necessity to be flexible and changing as you curve and slide and move over the rough and harsh things of the earth. And you, like human beings, guard a treasure that is hidden deep within the earth, like human beings, and yet the inner meaning of that treasure is not available to you. You guard it, but you cannot taste it. You cannot come close to it. You cannot recognize its inner meaning as a part of your own divine unity with all that truly is. Whereas you, peacock, you reflect it. You reflect that divine unity, but only on the outside. You are vain. Your aspiration has taken a certain form, an excessive form, and has manifested as vanity. So you see, snake and peacock, both of you represent a part of the whole, and your conflict has led you to argue with each other and thus demonstrate to me the nature of your opposition with each other, said Adi, the calculator. And then it was as if a voice from within Adi became audible. And that voice from within Adi said, "The snake and the peacock, what they actually share in common is that they both are alive. They both are alive and unique in their own selves. We see the rainbow sheen, the iridescence of the feathers of the peacock, and yet we also see, if we look closely at times, we see that same iridescence, that same rainbow glow upon the scales of the snake. So they are both endowed with life. Their conflict is illusory. Their conflict arises from each one has taken the nature of its own selfhood and in becoming attached to it it has become its own obstacle to them. Their own selfhood, their own uniqueness, and their conception of it, having seized upon it, has become an obstacle to them. And this is the meaning of the snake and the peacock. So Adi became wise after that. Very interesting. Okay, good. Yes, I see that time does what it does, but that's okay. This leads me then. Let me summarize some things really quickly for you. Oh my goodness. Unbelievable that the time does what it does. I hope there is much for us to contemplate. Let me just run through some things. Oh, I'm not running through them. I will use this time efficiently. We can examine then these things as utterances. Okay, here's why. Shabistari was challenged to distill the meaning of what he had learned in poetry. Part of what poetry is, I've mentioned all the more mystical aspects of what poetry is, but poetry is also concision. It can be concision. It can also be expansion. It can be concise. So let us see in an utterance of poetry, of Shabistari, what there is for us to further contemplate. Shabistari says, as part of an assembly of illuminated souls, Shabistari is among them. And he is quoted here. Shabistari says, "You are as the reflected eye of the unseen person. In that eye, his eye sees his own eye." So, in the hadith it is said, "I was a hidden treasure, and I desired to be known." Shabistari distills that meaning further when he says, "You are as the reflected eye of the unseen presence." Can you imagine that? You are, I am, an eye reflected of something unseen. And in that eye, the unseen sees itself. So this gives us an idea of relationship. All right. Shabistari goes on in a whole other realm of subject matter to give some advice. This is a good admonishment. This is an astonishing admonishment. Shabistari says this. He's very direct here. He minces no words. "Cast aside the vain tales and mystic states and visions." Cast aside the vain tales and mystic states and visions. "Dream not of lights, of marvels, of miracles, for your miracles are in worshiping the truth. All else is pride and conceit and illusion of existence." Get down to brass tacks. You can be entranced by all these beautiful things, just like the peacock. The iridescent lights, they glimmer and they shine, and they are hypnotic. It is their nature. The beautiful is also illusion. It can be understood as such. But you got to know where to put your attention when you want to understand it. Sometimes you have to clear the decks. Clear the decks. This is what Shabistari is saying. Can I go on just a little bit? Our notions, quickly to speak, are of the microcosm and the macrocosm. This poem, The Garden of Mystery, distills those most succinctly and perhaps most definitively. The originator, the exemplar of this polarity of the microcosm, the human being as a microcosm of the universe, and the universe as a macrocosm, as a gigantic reflection of the inner essence, which is the whole in the human being. The wholeness, the oneness, the unity of existence is in the individual, all there in its way. And in the universe, of course, it is all there in its way as well. Shabistari says, "Behold the world entirely contained in yourself. The world is you, and you are a world. Behold the world mingled together, angels with demons, Satan with the archangel, all mingled like unto seed and fruit together, and gathered in the point of the present. The heart of a barley seed equals 100 harvests. Those to whom unity is revealed see the absolute whole in the parts, yet each part is in despair at its particularization from the whole." Well, this is that. And that's the microcosm and the macrocosm. And it's all there in the point, in the single point, in the now of existence. It is all there, but it's all mingled together in a unique way. It is all there, but it is still to be discerned, that actual wholeness. Mm-hmm. All right. So now I can tell it's time for me to, having hopefully in this moment done my best to give you a taste, a flavor of the magnificent themes, the inner themes, the lessons, the savor, the depth that is in Shabistari when you study this work, The Garden of Mysteries. Now let me just read you a poem of my own. In this poem I've decided that the spontaneous polarity will be that between consciousness and conscience. Consciousness in this poem is the phenomenal aspect of the mind. Consciousness. Conscience is the essence, the knowing point of that mind. Knowing. Not just good and evil, but beauty and ugliness, and the large and the small, and dare I say it, the microcosm and the macrocosm. So this is the poem. It is called Something in the Capital City Where No One Goes. All the things that mean I am being good last only so long, for the real good does not need to see them meaning what they mean. All that is gone now, having gone away in the way the unnecessary goes away, transformed into what want and need were before vertical and horizontal went their separate ways. In the book where you turn the pages, changing costumes while remaining clothed, playing parts written by time's images of itself as thought. Conscience only guilt trips you when it is crying to be let out of its cage, yearning to escape direct sunlit glare. The wild bird of the soul, for the moment, pet-like, grateful for your care, neither ghost nor God. So this is how it is. I must ask you a riddle, and I'll answer it for you. How are animals and gods alike? Animals and gods are alike because both can be imagined as if they were people. Both can be imagined as if they were you and me. That's something to put in your bonnet and hope it doesn't become a bee. Or if it already is, hope it takes the sting away. Anyway, this is all just food for thought along the lines of the poetry of Shabistari and all other sublime poets. United with them all, we go on studying, learning and appreciating. And I thank you for your indulgence. And I thank you for your heroic listening. And we will all continue on our road of understanding, because that's the work we do in this world as human beings. Alrighty then. So long for now.